Summer Series, Part 10. Hello and welcome to the Ignite Youth Podcast here at Waynfleet BIC Church, where we discuss life through the lens of our Anabaptist roots. My name is Julie Adams, and this is Pastor Wes Hillis, our youth pastor.
How's it going?
Great. And yourself?
I'm doing good.
Good.
Yeah.
Awesome. So here we are, approaching the end of August.
Yes, yeah, we are almost at the end of August, and it's crazy to think that we're already there.
I know. Sometimes the beginning of summer, it feels like, it's all stretched out long before us, like long summer days.
No, I feel the opposite.
And then we blink, and it's like, here we are, staring down back to school shopping.
I look at summer, and I'm like, it's so short. I need to get so many things done.
Huh.
That's why
Well, at the beginning of July, I'm always like, oh yeah, we got all this time. And then by this point, I'm like, oh no.
We're running out of time.
It's weird. Time's so weird.
Me and Emerson went to Walmart the other day to buy supplies, and it was just all back to school, decked out shopping. And I looked at Emerson, I'm like, you need to get some supplies. And he's like, I'm not ready to talk about it yet. Because Emerson's going into his second year of uni. So, yeah, but what?
Nothing.
Did I say because it said uni?
Yeah, you're like British all of a sudden.
Do we not? Does not everyone say uni?
I don't think so.
Do we just say university?
Yeah.
I'll just say uni. I've always said uni.
I'm pretty sure you listen to too many football podcasts and stuff like that. That's soccer. I think I think that's the problem. Please weigh in. Comment on this podcast or video.
Why would I use more syllables if I don't have to?
All right. Now on to an easier topic.
Anne and Brandon would be so angry at me for saying that. They love words so much.
Well,
so today I'm going to use all the syllables.
Words.
So we are talking about the canonicity of Scripture.
Wonderful. Our favorite topic.
Yes.
I'm just kidding.
Yes.
What does it mean? Give us a definition.
So the canonicity of Scripture is essentially, it's talking about what kind of became canon. What is the canon of Scripture?
Define canon.
So canon is what we have for Scripture. It's considered to be our base, our pillar, our kind of. It's easier. So if I was to say an example I could use, I think it helps youth and other people. You have comic books.
Yeah.
They're comic books, but then people make movies of those comic books.
Yes.
And so if you were to base the movies directly off the comic books and all the events happen in the movie that were from the comic books, you'd say, oh, that is canon. Where if they were to go off the path and kind of just do something weird or random, you'd say, well, that's not actually canon. Okay. And so canon is kind of what Scripture has and holds, because, as we'll talk about, there's actually a lot of books out there that say to be Scripture that aren't actually Scripture. They're not actually canon. So canon is a term that kind of encompasses Scripture. This is what Scripture is.
Got it.
Yes.
Clear as mud.
My long-winded trying to figure that out as my head as well. So we're talking about the canonicity of Scripture, how it kind of came to be. This was a question that youth have actually asked before, because along with this question is how can we actually trust it, that it's real, that that we have the right books that we're meant to have,
we have all of it.
That we have all of it, exactly, because you could look at the Catholic faith, which has the Apocrypha. And so, we're going to dive into that a little bit. And so to know how we can actually trust it, you have to start with the Old Testament. Obviously, the Old Testament comes first. And so how do we know that the Old Testament that we have is true? And how do we know that it's something we can actually look at to be canon as something that it is? And the reason we can actually trust in it is because it's actually, with good confidence, we can say that the Old Testament was most likely the way it already is in the time of Jesus.
Okay.
And because of that, because you have an early Jewish historian named Josephus, who this guy, it wasn't just that he sided with the early church Christians or sided with the Jewish or he kept swapping groups a lot. And so a lot of his history, you'd actually be like, actually, because you kept swapping groups, you actually get a lot of good history within that. It wasn't just Roman-based history of just pushing down the Jews and not if it was just Roman-based, he would never have talked about Jesus. But he does talk about Jesus. So he kind of hits all these points.
Okay.
So Josephus actually gives us a list of 22 books. And those 22, and in our Old Testament, we have 39 books.
Yep.
But it actually matches up with ours. Because obviously, like, your 1st and 2nd Kings was never first. It was just one whole book, or 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Samuel. They were just one entirety book. The reason we split it is just for an easier sense of reading, which would have happened later on in years, especially when different translations would have started coming out, especially during the King James Version. And so the Old Testament, we can kind of take confidence that Jesus was actually, he would have had canon in Scripture that he would have been able to quote and learn from the temple to hear and read, that we still have today. You could look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, which...
Oh, I never thought of that Jesus would have, like, said read Scripture, like, and the same Scripture that we use today. Oh,
most likely how it would have ended up working was that a Pharisee or someone working within the temple or high priest would actually read it out. It wouldn't have just been, like, handed or passed out. Obviously, people would have Scripture memorized as well and have that written down on the parchments or different pieces of paper to say it during, like, when your family's doing Passover or other things. You would have these Scripture verses kind of around. But yeah, they would have most likely had Scripture kind of already. And then the New Testament is something that actually kind of flies. Like, it just kind of, like, it doesn't take long for it to kind of become canon. And obviously with the early Christian church, they wanted to kind of get it sorted out. But by the 2nd century, you already have books and letters that have been written to people being considered Scripture. And Scripture wasn't this word that was just thrown around here to say, like, oh yeah, that's fine, that's Scripture. But no, this was serious. In Peter's letters, he refers to Paul's letters as Scripture, that it is something that is, and Scripture has a lot of annotations that go on. I think I'm using that word right. And
like footnote, like
kind of like things that go along with it.
Yeah.
Scripture would have been used as something to consider holy, something to consider was God breathed, something to consider that was something that was divine almost. And so what Peter is referring to as Paul's writings is saying that that's Scripture.
Yeah.
That has a huge, like, weight to that. And so within the early church, we see Scripture kind of, like, just fly it, like, what the letters, books that all have been writing. You have an early gospel by the 200, like the 2nd century, like 200 AD, you have the gospel already written out, and it's just being sent all over. One of the things I love, especially when we're talking about the canonicity of Scripture, is that people say, well, the Bible is like this made up tale, like there's not a lot of proof about it. We have more proof that Jesus was a person that lived than Shakespeare. We have more documentation.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Shakespeare, like,
and no one doubts that.
No one doubts that Shakespeare or that Julius Caesar won all those battles or all of those things, or Alexander the Great even.
Yeah.
Yet we have so much more documentation, so much more eyewitness accounts, so much more written accounts that not just in Israel, but you have them in Greece, Turkey, Palestine, you have them in Iran, you have them in Ethiopia, you have them in Egypt, like all over the Mediterranean world, you're finding these New Testament Scriptures.
Yeah.
And as a person who, I love history, and so I want to know the facts. I want to know what's true. And a common notation in history is that when there is so much overwhelming evidence, you have to look at it. You can't just say, like, no, didn't really happen. And so a lot of this comes into the account that a lot of historians will look at all of the New Testament Scriptures and be like, okay, clearly, easy to tell, Jesus was a real person.
Yeah.
And I think that helps our basis, was to say the Scripture that we have is trustworthy.
Yep.
Because 2,000 years later, we've gone through so many different translations.
Yeah.
Which one of the questions is, why do we have so many different translations? People have different reading styles. Some translations are better for studying. Some translations are better for personal reflection. It's kind of like, nowadays, it's kind of more like whatever kind of floats your boat for what kind of you need.
Well, and language has changed so much over the years too.
So
like if you read like the King James Bible, it's I find it's a bit tough.
It's hard to read. There's no doubt about that.
And people used to talk like that, and now they don't. So language has changed.
And you also have to consider reading was much more of a formal thing rather than just a casual thing. You wouldn't have just your everyday person on the street being able to read necessarily. Yeah. The King James Version is written from 1516 is the original King James Version. And so I think I may have my dates wrong on that, but with that, in society at the time, your everyday common folk, not everyone knew how to read or write necessarily.
That's wild to think about.
And so to have then people actually being able to speak that to you, and the fact that our scripture is one of those things where I think a lot of people, like stories and myths over time, think, oh, people have added this or people have added that. But because of the early church, because of the weight that they held with scripture and how they were persecuted in a way, there's actually a very high held way that scripture was kept. It wasn't something that was just like, oh, we'll change this so we can fit in with the times.
Yeah.
No, it was actually, we need to almost hide this. We need to make sure it's safe. We need to make sure it's proper, that it keeps true.
Protected, yeah.
It's protected. And that kind of carries itself through the early church into the fall of the Roman Empire, into the church, into the medieval ages, even into the late 1800s, when, you know, scripture's kind of being brought into the world in a different way ever than before through the printing press.
Yep.
It's something that's held in such high value. People have died because of scripture.
Yeah.
And it's something to note that no one dies for a lie. Like no one, if you're going to go at someone for something, they're going to say the truth.
Yes.
But scripture, the canonicity is something I keep saying it wrong. It's something that we can trust because people have spent their lives on this. 2 Timothy 16 talks about how all scripture is God breathed. That this actually comes from God. This is something to actually take hold, and it is divine. It is something that of high importance.
Yeah.
It's not something that human hands have squandered or ruined. And so at the end of the thing of what we're talking about, of my long-winded a bunch of history and everything, canon of scripture is something that people have spent their lives working on. From, you have Josephus, who is an early Jewish historian, who talks about how they already had it by the time of Jesus.
Yeah.
If we were to take that, and now that we've added the New Testament on through the early church, we have this amazing story that has touched, like, when we really think about it, scripture has touched the lives of so many people through history.
Yep.
Like, it's almost overwhelming to think about that these verses, the way that David pleads out, like, has touched the hearts and lives of so many people, watching and seeing God work through people. And today, scripture is something that we can trust. It's something that is true, that is God breathed, that is not fiction, is not something that's just got thrown together and said, all right, here it is. But rather, it was time taken to really make sure that what it is.
Yeah.
And when we speak about other books, like the Book of Enoch or the Apocrypha or other things, the reason we don't consider that canon for us, especially, is different for the Catholic faith, is because it doesn't point to Jesus. Like, that's the whole point of this, is, does it actually point to Jesus? And, as BIC, we believe all scripture is the storytelling to Jesus. Yeah. The Old Testament points to Jesus. And so that's where we land. That's where we kind of believe, is that it has to point to Jesus. So yeah, that's kind of our sense of it. But I encourage anyone, like, dive into the history of it, learn more about it. Like, there's so much story, history, and rich fullness there that you can just dive into for hours and hours and see, like, the lives that it has touched with people who weren't even religious and didn't have a relationship with God, dive into scripture, even this real thing that people can trust, trying to disprove it and realize, oh my goodness, no, this is actually,
I love those stories where they're like, I'm going to prove them wrong, and then they come away being like, oh,
I was wrong.
I think
that's a beautiful thing there, that God doesn't be like, oh, really, you're going to come at me, but rather says, let me actually show you. Let me actually guide you along this path. Yeah. And so I think there's a beautiful relationship there between, the Bible and us and God. And so, yeah.
Have you got any resources if anyone wants to read any more, like a website or a book or anything?
If you just search the canonicity of scripture, you can find a Bible Gateway, different biblical sources all over, which, because I think most denominations would agree on the canonicity of scripture, you can find a lot of good sources to read.
Yeah.
The BIC has the Handbook of Faith and Life, which
Mm-hmm.
talks about, doesn't talk about the canonicity of Scripture, but it talks about the revelation of Scripture, how Jesus is the ultimate revelation. And so if you want to go read that, you can find it on the BIC Canada's website.
I think we've got a hard copy in
We
the
do have
library
hard
too.
copies as well. Yeah. And so, yeah, there's plenty of resources out there you can find. You just got to search for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Pastor
Sweet.
Wes.
Yeah.
If you want to get in touch with Wes, if you have any questions or want to discuss this anymore, you can reach him at wes@waynefleetbic.com. And my email address is julie@waynefleetbic.com. So thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Have a great week.
Bye.